Hey guys, just want to go over a quick video about officers and how to crew and general crewing suggestions and whatnot. Um, Initially, I'll go over the initial set and how you progress from there, right? So your initial hostile crews are going to be um, the cadets. Will be the cadets and the will be these guys. So you'll have LaForge captain with Crusher and Data, and you'll also have the cadets, which are Sulu. Well, you'll have O'Hara as captain with McCoy, and then someone else. Um, Typically, these can be associated, so you can go O'Hara, McCoy, and then Chen, and you can have your other crew with Talan. I'll explain how Chen and Talan work in a bit when we get to your next crew. So your next crew after that will be Pike, Moreau, Chen, Pike, Moreau, Talan. What these effectively do is Pike multiplies your officer abilities by 2.2, by a factor of 2.2, um, meaning your Moreau gives them a large accuracy decrease, and it pumps up the reduction from Chen and Talan, which means when you're fighting against um, explorers that only deal energy damage, you're reducing both the accuracy and damage by a significant portion. You're also, when you're fighting as battleships, Moreau's ability to reduce accuracy becomes incredibly important because effectively you're fighting with an interceptor against battleships. You want to use that triangle, and then when you're fighting with an interceptor against battleships, your primary mitigation is dodge, which then gets amped up a lot by Moreau reducing their accuracy, which leads to the third Pike Moreau combination that a lot of people don't use, but you'll use it when you're fighting high level probes, especially in waves. It's amazing. That is Pike Moreau Data. Data giving you isolated cascade, then getting multiplied while still having the mitigation from um, Moreau's doubled ability. So that's effectively where you'll be with sitting with when you're hitting probes and high probes in Q trials or wave defenses. You want to put on Pike, Moreau, and Data. Now we'll get to the three basic states that crews will use. One is morale, one will be um, burning, one will be hull breach. Burning gives 1% hull damage per round that the target is burning. Hull breach gives you, when the target is hull breached, any critical strikes against it are increased by 150% on top of your original critical strike damage. And then morale gives you penetration values. Morale's the weakest there, but you'll use those crews when you get your G3 epics because they all rely on them in some way, and you'll use them to pump them up. So when you are moving on from those hostile crews and you're starting to look through crews for more single target damage, one quick thing here that I want to do before is when you're fighting against yellow targets, effectively mission bosses and stuff like that. Crews that you can use are incredibly limited. Um, the only mitigation that you can use is 5 of 11, and then you'll want to use either a combination of full offense, being Gorkon Khan, or you can go. One of my favorites is go 5 of 11 and Kirk and Spock. And that's a great way to mitigate as much damage as possible, last as long as in the fight. But other officers don't work. So what you'll be wanting to do in that case is you'll be wanting to load up the lower decks with health values to be able to give your 5 of 11 more mitigation. That's against yellows. Yeah, moving on to single targets and armadas. Crewing for those. Um, when you're on your Enterprise, you want to have Kirk. When you're on your Augur, you want to have Nero. When you're on the D4, you don't want to have Gorkon. Gorkon relies on crits in order to proc him, which can be inconsistent. An officer like Lorca or something like that would be much better to proc the Hull Breach. Gorkon is useful if you can consistently proc Hull Breach, if you can consistently crit with a good percentage, which we'll be looking at which I've talked about in the Stellar video, because the Stellar has a lot of hits. The Stellar Armadas have a lot of hits. Khan procs a lot, and you can use that to trigger the trigger the damage. But then that Hull Breach will only be coming later, and what you're wanting to be doing on the D4 is building up Hull Breach from the beginning. So Lorca is a lot better with a D4. And those will all just be on the side. Those won't be those won't be captains. For captains, the Enterprise is always main form of power comes from its shield. So having a captain like Janeway, who officer ability gives you damage, but also the captain ability redirects a higher portion of the damage gets mitigated into shields, which then can be regened. So it's like an incredibly good captain for the Enterprise. And then what you're effectively wanting to always have when you're creating for these things is mitigation and then damage. And you get two forms of mitigation. One is in shields, which is set like 80% value, I think it is, until the shield is depleted, and then the other mitigation is integer mitigation, done by a percentage of your officer goes to mitigation stats and stuff like that, which you'll be wanting to. If you can get both, they're amazing. So this is why with the Enterprise, what you wanting, you get one form of shield regen, so your shield's always up, so you always have that mitigation, and then you want to have Paris below deck, so you have integer mitigation as well. You effectively want to have both, which comes to the main officer for the other two ships, Augur or D4, or basically any other ship that doesn't have the ridiculous shield regen of an Enterprise, and that officer is Beverly. Beverly allows you to have both mitigation and shield regen in one officer, and she's going to be your captain. What you do with her is you just stick her as a captain, load your lower decks up with officers that are high in both defense and health, and that gives you your mitigation and your both forms of mitigation in one officer. So there'll be your shield regen as well as your integer mitigation by officer stats, and you'll be wanting to have her as your captain, which allows you frees up the other two slots. So with usually your third slot is going to be a damage slot. There are very few officers, if any, that I know of that are as good in that slot right now at the point that we are at as Khan is, especially once tiered up to tier 2, and beyond that he becomes even stronger, right? So your typical Enterprise crews are going to look like probably something like this, where you've got Khan, Janeway, and Kirk, and you wanting to have below here when you're fighting against armadas, you're wanting to have Paris, and then you stack up all of this with basically with defense to pump up the Paris ability, and then that gives you a really good crew. So you have your ship ability fueled by a Khan, you have your mitigation given by your shield mitigation increased by Janeway, you have your integer mitigation by Paris, and you have damage by this. And that's kind of like the recipe that you want with all ships. So what I do on other ships, I would have Beverly, I'd have something Beverly Khan, and then Gorkon would trigger off that, or you could go Beverly. If you're on an Augur, I would go Beverly Nero Khan, and depending on how you want to have those crews set up, but that's your typical thing. And your Beverly gives you your integer mitigation, then you just load up your lower decks with the effective ones are just going to be like Paris. If you're on the Enterprise, you can put Kim for more morale procs. Not that you need it with Kirk, but on the other ones, it's definitely nice to have like Torres on D4. Torres is just good anyway, and Neelix on the auger. Yeah, so that's your basic recipe for crewing. Is you want to have mitigation, damage, and if your ship ability is if you have a G3 epic, or you have a relevant ship ability where the G3 epics rely on morale, burning, or hull breach, you can have an officer for that. And the two kinds of mitigation, shield regen and shield and mitigation percentage, you want them both if possible. That's why a really nice crew as well is the your standard Kirk Spock, and then some mitigation. So if you don't have Khan, and or you, for some reason you just want to survive long, say you're using it on a Defiant in a solo armada, and you kind of just wanted to sponge extra hits. It's maybe not your strongest ship, but you wanted to sponge as many hits as possible. You could go for like morale, uh, Kirk Spock, and then like 5 of 11 or whatever. But you're probably in if you have an enterprise in solos, you'll probably be using your Kirk, in which case you find another way. You can always just use the full mitigation selection of the board crew of 5, 6, 7. 5 and 7 are incredibly synergistic, and that 5 gives mitigation according to officer health, 7 increases your officer health, so you get like a feedback loop there of a very nice amount of mitigation, although you don't have the shield regen, but that's fine, you can't get it on all the ships. But yeah, so your general crew will be that. Now for solo armadas, what I typically do is I'll lean on one ship heavily, and put like my best crew in it. So I would, because I've got an Enterprise. Enterprise is very strong against solo armadas. Can last long. Is I actually kit out the Enterprise to basically solo the solo armada. The other ships are just going to be sponges, and then on the other ships I use loot crews. So something like Geordie, LaForge. So I'll use 5, 6, 7 on one, because that's a lead crew, and that works off armadas. And then on another one, I will use Geordie, and him with full synergy gives a like 90%, no sorry, 80% extra loot. So then I'll put like Geordie full loot crew on one, and I'll put on the other one I'll put 5, 6, 7, and then I will uh, have the Enterprise carry it with a full proper crew. And that's how I run solo armadas. Is I have one ship like that does most of the damage, and the other ships that are just amping the rewards. And then yeah, so the other ships die off, the one remains, I get like much more rewards. But that's typically a quick rundown on crew. I'm sure I've missed a ton. I can quickly go over some lower deck stuff that I see people doing often, which is so be careful to just toss in all the lower deck officers that you have. Try be more selective, because a lot of officers that I've talked about require stats. So something like Spock has shield regen according to defense. Um, uh, Bev has both shield regen on health as well as integer mitigation on defense. So all these officers want stats. So put only the low deck officers that you actually find are going to be very important. So for armadas, I basically only use Tom Paris below deck and Troy for some crit damage. If I know that my Khan's gonna ramp up quite high, I'll use Troy. So I'll use him, her, and I'll use my third one. If I'm using health mitigation, I'll use someone like Hemmer to increase my officer's health. So if I've got the Doctor and I'm using him as my integer mitigation, remember this is the integer mitigation, and that relies on health. So then I'll use someone like Hemmer below deck to increase my officer health. Or I'll only use the below deck officers as possible because the slots are important. Because with the rest of the slots, you want to be pumping as high stats there as possible. You want to be getting your stats big because that's what's going to give you your shield ridge, and that's what's going to give you your mitigation. That's what's going to give you. It's not just 200% mitigation; it's 200% of officer health, including your lower decks. So you want to be stacking your lower decks with relevant high health officers in order to be able to take advantage of that. Okay, cool setters in there. Yeah, and that's basically the idea of crewing. I'm sure I've missed a ton, but if that can give a rough idea, and that'll help. Always hit me up if you have any questions.